Live. My name is Jorge Galindo, and we're streaming live from the UN Migration Agency's headquarters in Geneva. Today we'll talk about the impact of climate change on population movements around the world, and I'm joined by Robin Bronen, who's the Executive Director at the Alaska Institute for Justice. She's currently working with 15 Alaska Native communities to design and implement a community-based relocation process based in human rights principles. The Alaska Institute for Justice is a nonprofit agency that is the only immigration legal service provider in Alaska and houses a language interpreter center, training bilingual Alaskans to be professional interpreters, and also is a research and policy institute focused on climate justice issues. Robin, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Can you tell us what is happening this winter in Alaska? Why are you here in Geneva today?
So every December, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issues a report, which is a report card on the state of the Arctic. And this past December, they said that the Arctic is no longer going to be the frozen region it has been for the last several hundred years, because of the rapid decline of Arctic sea ice, the fact that we are also losing snow. So this winter it has rained more than it has snowed in many parts of Alaska, including where I live in Anchorage, which has been really difficult. But along the coast where the indigenous communities live, it's been raining instead of snowing, and the ground hasn't been frozen for most of the winter.
And what data and evidence do we have about the impact of these changes in the climate on migration in Alaska?
Well, so the communities with whom we're working have been identified by the federal government as being imminently threatened by flooding and erosion, and that assessment was made in 2009. And with the work that we're doing with the communities, because they live in very remote regions of our state, so it's important to understand that these communities are not connected by road. The only way that you can travel there in the wintertime is by small 10-seater planes. And so the impacts from the storms coming in haven't been well documented. And what we've noticed this past winter is the impacts of storms are increasing because the Arctic sea ice used to be the barrier along the coastline, and that Arctic sea ice is no longer there, and so we don't get hurricanes in Alaska, at least not yet, but we get hurricane strength storms. So we can get storms with 150 mile per hour kilometer winds, and without that Arctic sea ice as a barrier, there are enormous storm surges that have caused intense flooding and erosion in the communities. And so they are now, 3 communities at a minimum are now thinking about relocating their entire community, and several of the communities that we're working with are having to relocate homes from the coastline from where they're located.
And can you tell us a bit more about what type of environmental migration are we witnessing in Alaska? Is it going to be permanent or temporary? Is it forced or voluntary? Is it within borders or also across borders? What are we witnessing right now?
Well, I think the thing to think about for not only Alaska, but many regions of the world is we are talking about permanent migration. So as you mentioned, I work at an immigration legal service provider. I was Alaska's first state refugee coordinator. And with refugee movements, which are cross-border in nature, and people are leaving areas of conflict, there is still the possibility of going home, right? After the conflict resolves, they need to have refuge for a defined period of time, and then the hope is that conflict will resolve itself and people can go back to the places that they love. With climate change, that's not going to be possible. So when we talk about permanent, we're talking about the permanent disappearance of land. And the other thing that's happened this winter is since January 1st, the temperatures at the northernmost coast of Greenland, 61 hours has been above freezing on the northernmost coast of Greenland this winter since January 1st, and there's been open water. And if Greenland melts, that means that many coastal regions around the world are going to disappear and people will permanently have to move. So that, in regard to the indigenous communities in Alaska, they are moving within the state of Alaska. That's one of the human rights pieces to this, is that they are they harvest the foods in the area where they live, and so staying within the region where they are is critically important, but it's a permanent move. There's no going back to where they are.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like we tend to hear more about sudden natural hazards in the news than we do about the so-called slow onset events, like drought, for example, sea level rise. Why do you think that's the case, and what is our role in the UN and in partnership with organizations like yours to raise awareness about these issues?
That is a great question. So that's a serious problem because I work as a human rights lawyer, and I'm most familiar with the laws of the United States related to this issue. And so one of the things that we know is that the way that disaster is defined in the United States, it's primarily about extreme environmental events like hurricanes, like tornadoes, and drought is the only slow, ongoing environmental event that is included in the definition of what an environmental catastrophe is that merits then disaster response and funding. Right? So the work that we're doing, and we're doing it right now with scientists, is we are redefining what a catastrophe is in regard to the way that environmental change is affecting the indigenous communities in Alaska, because that is step one, is we have to recognize that sea level rise, we've got to come up with a different word for erosion, because these are not necessarily going to be slow, ongoing environmental events. What we're seeing in Alaska is that there's an acceleration of change that's happening now that warrants us looking at that environmental definition differently and defining it differently so that communities can get access to the funding that's normally related to disasters.
I would like to ask you one final question. We know that you're here to speak at a debate later tonight for the Film Festival on Human Rights, and this is part of an ongoing partnership between the Institute and the Platform on Disaster Displacement, who works very closely with IOM. What type of work are you engaged in terms of partnerships with the United Nations?
Yeah, so I'm an advisory committee member for the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and that's the major venue that I am invited into to talk about how environmental change, the climate crisis in Alaska is affecting population movements within the state. Because the Arctic is warming at least twice as fast as the lower latitudes, and so the lessons that we are learning in Alaska, my hope is that through the Platform on Disaster Displacement, through the connection with IOM, that these lessons are then being taken to an international level and informing these international processes that are trying to address the fact that this is going to be the greatest human rights challenge of our times.
Robin, thank you so much again for joining us, and best of luck tonight at the debate. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out all our social